Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Beth. Thanks to everyone for attending here. My task is just to give a brief overview of kind of why we're looking at whey and why it's important and things like that. So I'm going to talk in some very broad strokes. So certainly, if I talk of any key principle, there are certainly some exceptions there, and we can certainly get into the weeds if need be, but I'm talking in broad strokes, so please appreciate the design of this kind of overview presentation. Indeed, we're talking about, let's see, whey. So here's a picture of what we mean. So most of the whey that we generate in Wisconsin looks something like this. We have milk in a vat. We're recovering primarily the bulk of the casein protein, and that would, is the basis for curd formation and so forth. And then the balance of this liquid, this yellowish greenish liquid, that's the whey. That's what we're talking about. And over the course of my career, this sentiment has been shared. Two things that are critical to note. For every, 10 pounds of milk go in that vat, we'll get approximately 1 pound of cheese and 9 pounds of whey. It's like a lot of whey. So that's one, right? Just a general thing to think about. The other is that there's some companies so we've come to discover the value of whey, like how valuable it is, why it's important, and so forth. And there are some companies that would say, we'd make more cheese if we could get rid of the whey. However, there are also companies that say, we'd make more whey if we could get rid of the cheese because of its growing value. Okay, so why are we looking at whey? So here are just some key points. One, it has exceptional nutrition. So if we look at the nutritional value and merit of whey, there are various reasons why it has some really unique properties as a food for us to consume. It's also has very broad nutritional applications. So it's not just, this helps my bones stay strong, but rather it has multiple functions, and I'll try to illustrate that in a second here. We make a lot of it, and I'll speak to that as well. So Wisconsin makes a lot of whey. So, and not only are there broad nutritional properties, but it has broad functional properties. So in the food industry, we're looking at whey as an ingredient, and we have an interest in having clean labels. So today I have a call how to formulate something that's more clean label. So whey and all of its fractions has functionality, a broad spectrum of functionalities in foods. And we're still exploring, which is why the rest of the talks today will really be about those particular subjects. So let me just touch briefly on a model for understanding the nutritional value of whey. So if we ask, so Beth here has her credentials in nutrition and so forth, and I'm going to make a statement, and if Beth will give me a yes or a no if I'm way off. But if we were to ask just for a general population, what is a good balanced diet, it might look something like this, right? So we might have grains and vegetables and fruit. We might have some protein on that. We'd have milk in there. So I think this is probably a fairly safe platform to say that we a wide variety of products in moderation, that type of a thing. And as you look at these foods, you might think they're dramatically different, and they are, right? So you compare the grape to a mushroom, or sausage to a bell pepper, or like chemically, nutritionally on different planets, right? But we need to wrap our arms around all of them to keep our body healthy, right? So again, broad strokes, but I'm speaking of a framework that helps us understand the value of milk and the value of whey, okay? So here's a statement that a colleague of mine made some years ago. Milk is the only food designed to sustain life. And in broad strokes, when we're first born, right, we are in our fastest growing time of our life, right? We're not eating this, but we're thriving on this. And I juxtapose those two frames to illustrate, milk and by nature, by association, whey has this tremendous nutritional content, nutritional value. And so with that as a framework, that's one point I'll sort of have you keep in mind. So as we start to unravel whey, we start to understand the variety of different nutritional implications it has. So protein value and digestibility, muscle growth and repair, like all these things. It's a long list of nutritional value and attributes that whey products, whey ingredients contribute to. And so you'll see, so I stole this slide from one of the speakers here, but just to, as we as we delve into those subjects, we find some very complex systems that in whey that help us understand and characterize the value of whey and whey ingredients. And just many of the talks are on that subject today. Okay, so how much? So, depending on who you ask, the numbers may vary a little bit, but it's safe to say that we make a lot of whey, right? Make an enormous amount of whey, not only in Wisconsin, not only the U.S., but across the globe, we make an enormous amount of whey. And I just did some, cocktail napkin calculations. In the state of Wisconsin, we make a aircraft carrier's weight of whey every year, right? So if you've ever been to an aircraft carrier and seen how large those are, you kind of maybe puts it in perspective. But again, we make a lot of it, and that's a fairly clear point to capture. And whey examination, I'm also going to suggest that we kind of bore into two broad categories of whey evaluation. Mike Molitor from CDR is here. His former boss, Rusty Bishop, used to talk about whey as and characterize it like it's a car. It has all these complex components in it, right? So there's springs, there's tires, there's, I don't know much about cars, but whatever, right? A bunch of stuff in it, right? And they all have different functional properties. And if you go to an auto parts store and say, I want all the parts for a Ford Escort, it's a fortune, right? And so because all those parts individually have unique values, right? Together as a car, you can go to the local store and buy a car, right? That's it's quarter of the price, right? So we're part of the research we're doing in whey looks at what are the parts, right? So this is a car kind of exploded in all its parts, and whey is dramatically more complicated than this car. But just as a model in your mind, I'd have you think of whey has all these different components and fractions that we're looking to identify and characterize and utilize to their fullest potential. So that's one broad area of research. The other is Rusty. Also, I'm stealing from Rusty Bishop here, but he also would talk about how we look at whey not unlike we look at crude oil. Like we pump crude oil out of the ground, and it's this kind of a rough-hewn commodity. But then we start fractionating it, right, in all these valuable ingredients. Now, crude oil is relatively very simple as a basic material, but we're trying to refine whey. It's one thing to find, we have this unique fraction in whey and it's really valuable. It's another thing to be able to find it, to refine it, to purify it in a way that is in concert with standards for food and pharmaceutical manufacturing. So as you look at the presentations today, and probably the vast majority of work done on whey research kind of falls into, most of them fall into one of these two categories. We're trying to find out what's there, and we're trying to refine it. And you'll see examples of that throughout this morning's talks. So that is a kind of a segue, right? What's going on in these two areas? And with that, I think I'll end my time here. Brief overview on what we talk about relative to whey. I'm not sure where I'm at on my time. I tend to speak pretty quickly, but I'm good on time, so no questions. Well, we can ask questions. Maybe a time for one or two questions.
And I will make an announcement today too. If you are going to ask a question, we ask that you use the microphone because our sessions are being recorded. So that helps us record your audio as well. Any questions?
Even though I could just walk over and ask him in the office, but among the components within whey, where do you think the most value is either as a component and or in nutrition or food science?
Yeah, so what are maybe some of if we were to make a top 10 list of what's most valuable, right? And so how I would answer that question would be, you're probably asking the wrong person. And any other questions though? And the reason why is because that question is probably best answered in the context of someone who understands the economics of dairy processing. So if Mike and I were to talk on this, we'd probably talk about, we could talk about the value of the water, right, that a plant is generating when they're processing whey. So they have a lot of, might call it cow water, in fact, because that has terrific implications for how the plant is utilizing water, which can be a huge expense. So even water, right, has a terrific value. You'll hear Wenjaya speak about lactose. So in terms of mass, water's first, right? And then the next is lactose. Lactose, kind of boring. No one really talks about lactose much. But however, lactose has a very unique sugar in it called galactose. And that sugar is really not found in significant quantities anywhere except for milk. And because of the way it's of that unique molecule, we can do things to it, and you'll hear about that later on this morning, that make it extremely valuable. So prices go from, they go up in orders of magnitude, right? You'll hear about fractions that have significant input. So that's just like an economist talking, and that's why I'm sort of saying, look, I think that response is probably dependent on the constraints that economist is working under. So as we start to look at these minor fractions, right? They might have significant implications for someone who has significant health concerns, right? A certain stage of their life, a certain health issue that they're dealing with, and so forth. So some of these fractions have pharmaceutical level value, right? And so it kind of depends almost, right? But again, you can look at anything in whey, and because we make so much of it, it all has a value. So, but a great question. Oh, thank you. See in the back there.
Hi, I'm Ayushi from CDR. My question is, as you mentioned in your presentation as well, whey is often a headache for industries, and they don't want to spend much resources in terms of research. So and equally, it is nutritionally valuable, and there is a lot of research going around. So how to make them realize, or what's the way to get the research more impactful in terms of whey?
Yeah, that's a great question. So really, you're asking a question about how can we better defend or justify a robust research engine that looks at these two fronts, and it's certainly a valuable question. And I would say over the course of my career, where funding has not gotten greater, right, it's gotten more and more competitive, I'd also say that there's a shift from simply doing research for research's sake and having a great publication and a talk at the DIH forum and so forth, to now the grant, you're right, has to have a techno-economic analysis with it. So NSF, for instance, not only do you have to do your research, but you have to defend it from a financial standpoint. Our patenting office does a similar thing. They're asking you questions to identify how valuable this is. And I think their other constraint involves sort of regulatory concerns, not only from a food safety, but labeling, processing, allergens, things like that also sort of have a role in that dynamic. I think the thing is, though, I think what academia and research engines need to think about is how to bridge that gap, right? So I think asking so I think Wenjaya will share a little bit, and he's the only work I know of intimately of, but I think you'll share something about the economics of your work. Is that right? So you'll see a little example. So Wenjaya, he'll speak later, we'll talk a little bit about what we mean when we say, when we're trying to defend, or we have economic numbers to sort of defend what we're doing, why we're doing it, why it's valuable. Now to some, that puts a constraint on what research we do. However, right, so that's kind of my intermediate answer, is that, I think part of the answer is really to defend what we do in one way, in an economic sense, to make it feasible. The other thing, and I think Wenjai will talk about this too, is it's one thing to have it on the benchtop. It's another thing to have it in food grade, food scale equipment. And that leap is difficult, And so I think our ability, like CDR has many of these large scale, but still pilot scale equipment, is a unique asset to have, right? And so I think that's another, so is it feasible? Can you feasibly do this? So I think that's another space that we would be, it's another compelling force for us to help bridge that gap and generate more focus and research interest and investment in whey, for instance. So I'm probably way over my time, but
Yes, we're going to go ahead and stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much
Dr.
for your time,
Rankin.
everyone.
Appreciate you being here today.